for the wonderful Plymouth Church, and I hope you all support its transformation. My dad, like Don here, was in a wheelchair, so the idea that Reverend Hagler and the church is making this place accessible is so important, and unfortunately extremely expensive. So I hope everyone helps out there, and also helps our wonderful Sanctuary of Dissent, which is WPFW. I just want to say how pleased I am that Tia Stitt, who spent equally long hours today producing the WPFW many-hour broadcast. We broadcast from 10 until 3, and it was a joint public television and radio broadcast. WAUT also ran the full 5 hours. When we got off the air at 3, and I was trying to help my melted colleagues get to the train, I turned on, of course, 89.3 FM, and there they were continuing the broadcast through 6 from the Washington Monument, and I was utterly impressed. And to continue to hear those voices, we have something very important to celebrate. And that is community radio, Pacifica Radio, right here in the nation's capital. Yeah. So as we travel on this 50-city tour throughout the country, we are also doing, as Dennis said, and a special thank you to Dennis Moynihan, who co-authored Democracy Now! 20 Years Covering the Movements Changing America, and makes these massive broadcasts possible. Last night when we saw the difficulty of placing a satellite truck, how would we save the space? How would we not have a bad interaction with police to ensure that we could broadcast from the front of the line across the street from the museum? I turned around and Dennis was no longer there as he scoped out the place. I'm calling him on his phone. He's raced off to Union Station to a Hertz there. He rents 2 cars. He had just bumped into a tow truck. And he said, "What time will you stop towing trucks?" He said, "Well, today at 6:30. That was last night." He said, "And you're not going to tow them after that?" He said, "Nope." So Dennis got 2 big SUVs, and he placed them at 6. This is how we operate. You can believe that an entire global broadcast that millions are watching and listening to is dependent on Dennis flailing his way through the streets of DC to find a Hertz that actually had some cars last night, and getting 2 of them, parking them right there across from the museum. The only reason we were able to have a space that the satellite truck operators came to this morning and comfortably set up. I'll talk about you know, before this mass event, and we were here last week covering the March for Science from 10 until 3 as well, and it was so beautiful to see those signs, especially young girls like Serafina were carrying, who are 9 and 10 and 11 years old, science enthusiasts, who are carrying signs that said things like, "I'm with her," with an arrow, the Mother Earth. And ice has no agenda, it just melts. And of course, these signs were out there today. There is no planet B. So, continuing to cover all the issues every morning wherever we do the broadcast. The last 2 days we were broadcasting from Burlington, Vermont. On Monday, we'll broadcast from New York, then Durham, North Carolina, then Atlanta, then Tampa, then Miami. Wow. Oh my gosh. Then Minnesota, Carleton College, and Minneapolis. And then we'll go on to Madison, Wisconsin. Sunday, we'll be in 3 cities in Michigan, Lansing, and Grand Rapids, and Also will be, Dennis reminded me, I've forgotten Chicago. Oh, I will not forget Chicago, which, by the way, it was pouring rain today. And in the midst of our broadcast, we brought you the voices of people in the downpour in Chicago. And we got photographs from where Dennis lives in Denver in the cold snow. People wrapped up like snow bunnies. It was truly amazing. But people came out. The downpour of people and the uprising that we experienced. One of the signs was the oceans are rising, and so are we.
Yes.
But we're covering all of the issues as we go through the country. And the last 2 weeks has been astounding in Arkansas. Dennis and I write a column every week for Hearst papers, and that column was about an attempted mass killing in Arkansas.
Yeah.
You know what the state tried to do and have accomplished this April in these days. They announced they would kill 8 men in 11 days. 8 condemned men, prisoners on death row. I guess to teach the world, thou shalt not kill. And the horror of I think they plan to have 3 double headers. I couldn't even believe that term. I have a nephew. My brother who co-authored this book with us, David Goodman. My nephew is 16. He goes to high school in Burlington, Vermont, in Waterbury, Vermont, and he is a great sports broadcaster throughout Vermont on television and radio. I know doubleheaders from him, especially when it comes to covering the Red Sox. But the idea that is what a double execution is called in Arkansas, and that they would have multiple nights where 2 men would be killed. What was the rush? That their supply of the execution drug midazolam was going to expire by tomorrow, by Sunday. Now, when I first heard this, that this wasn't an issue of justice for the courts, it was one of their death drugs was going to expire, and I couldn't understand it. I mean, I know that when drugs expire, you shouldn't have them because, what, they can kill you? I could not understand what the issue was. Of course, it might also be that they would become ineffective. And why are the drugs expiring and they can't get more? Well, that goes to movements. It started in Europe. The European Union forbid European drug companies from providing drugs used in executions. I mean, people in this country have very little awareness of how alone we are in the industrialized world in carrying the death penalty.
Wow.
And it's absolutely critical we do it. If we could broadcast an execution, we would. I know that sounds gruesome and horrific. But I really
back to the Wild
believe
West.
that people saw what was done in their name. Images matter. And we have to shine light to make these issues transparent. I really do believe Americans are compassionate people, and if they knew, and that's up to us in the media. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but this drug, midazolam, now, European drug companies have forbid their drugs being used to kill people. Yes. And that goes back to the Holocaust, a particular sensitivity there. Yes, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer. Adolf Hitler did use gas to kill millions of Jews and others.
Yes, Sean.
Yes, that did happen. And drug companies no longer want to be a part of that. And then it extended across the Atlantic to U.S. companies. It was right before Good Friday that a judge named Wendell Griffin ruled in a drug case in Arkansas. It was the McKesson Company, and they sued Arkansas because they said they had provided another drug, I think it's called Verpuronium bromide, and that Arkansas had misrepresented that it would be used for an execution. And this judge ruled on the company's behalf.
Forgive my shaky hands, guys. I have a really
The judge
bad neck.
then went outside and went over to the governor's mansion and lay down on a cot on Good Friday.
Saw that, Judge.
An African-American judge in protest of the death penalty.
I saw it.
These are the image we don't get in the corporate media.
I
So
saw it.
the first doubleheader was stopped. That sends a chill through me when I say it. But it is very important we express the language that's used, because I think then people will respond. That was stayed. The next person, Leland Lee, he was executed. In that case, the case went to the Supreme Court. There was a real issue of innocence. The ACLU picked it up at the end. You know, the death penalty, what it's related to. I mean, less than 1% of cases is the death penalty involved for a murder case. So what determines whether a person gets the death penalty or not? It is the color of their skin, the color of the victim's skin, and of course their economic status. Yes. That's what ultimately determines it. So he was, to say the least, would have no adequate representation, drunken attorneys. He would, the murder scene was extremely bloody, blood everywhere. He didn't have a speck of blood on him. The ACLU tried to take this case at the end, but it was too late. In the end, it went to the Supreme Court. And in a 5-4 decision, in one of the first decisions in the new Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch, Leland Lee was executed. So then we move on to the next group of men. And we reported after Monday night on our Tuesday show about the 2 men who were killed Monday night. We talked to the Guardian's chief reporter, Ed Pilkington, about the shocking double execution Arkansas carried out Monday night, marking the first time in 17 years that any state has killed 2 people on the same day. At 7:20 Arkansas time, 52-year-old Jack Earl Jones was pronounced dead in the death chamber at the Cummins Unit State Prison. Infirmary workers had spent more than 45 minutes unsuccessfully trying to put a central line into his neck. According to a court filing, during Jones' execution, he was moving his lips and gulping for air, which suggests he continued to be conscious during the lethal injection. Lawyers for the second man, Marcel Williams, filed a last-minute appeal for a stay of execution following Jones' killing, arguing Williams could also experience a botched, painful death. A district court judge initially granted a temporary stay of Williams' execution, but then allowed the execution to go forward. Williams was pronounced dead at 10:33 p.m. The executions came after legal challenges reached the U.S. Supreme Court, which rejected a stay for Williams. The only justice to dissent in this ruling was Justice Sonia Sotomayor. The last double execution.
Yep.
The last double execution carried out in the United States was carried out in Texas in the year 2000. So that was the next 2 men to be killed. There was another murder, another execution, a state murder on Thursday night. And that brought the total to 4 out of the 8 that Arkansas wanted to kill before midazolam expired tomorrow. Now, this brought to my mind our effort in 2011 that remarkable year where the bottom rocked the top throughout the world, an execution we attempted to cover in Georgia. And I want to talk about the case of Troy Anthony Williams. But 2011, I mean, it started really in December of 2010 in Tunisia with a young man named Mohamed Bouazizi who came out of university, had no opportunity, was selling fruit and vegetables in the marketplace. And the authorities took his scale. He was tired of the harassment, and he ultimately set himself on fire. And that was the spark of the Tunisian revolution that overthrew their dictator, and that sparked the Egyptian revolution next door, that after 18 days in Tahrir led to the overthrow of Mubarak, the dictator who reigned for decades, sadly supported by the United States, as the Tunisian dictator had been. And after that, million people joining together in every walk of life in Egypt and overthrowing their government. I mean, what's happened now in Egypt is another story. This is a revolution unfulfilled at this point. But moving forward in 2011, we then had the Wisconsin uprising where 150,000 people marched against the governor, Scott Walker, who would later run for president because he wanted to bust the public unions. The nurses and the teachers. He assured the police and the firefighters he wouldn't touch them. But his problem was that police and the firefighters were married to the nurses and the teachers. All those up.
I'm sorry, guys. I'm trying my best.
We flew into the Madison State Capitol. They occupied the state capitol. I mean, I went over to the governor's office, and there were young people with dreads down their back. They were drumming on anything they could find, and the police were rocking out next to them. I come from New York. We don't see those kind of things. And then you had the prison guards from Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and they were there. They were big. And I went up to them and I said, well, who did you vote for? And they said, well, Governor Walker, of course. And I said, but why are you here? And they said, protesting Governor Walker.
Oh, my.
Outside in the snow was an older gentleman, white hair and glasses, walking in the snow with a sign that said, IRS auditors against Walker. He was through. I said, are you a Republican or a Democrat? He said, I'm a Republican. He said, he didn't tell us he was going after our neighbors. And then from there, and this is so important, looking out over the vista of 150,000 people marching in the freezing cold. I saw the Labor Museum across the street. And, you know, Wisconsin is an interesting place. It's the home, the birthplace of the John Birch Society. Yeah. John Birch Society, co-founded by Fred Koch, the father of the Koch brothers, that racist, segregationist organization. But it's also the home of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, in 1932. So you've got these two different threads in it. And as I look out, if you ever think these movements don't make a difference, I mean, think about AFSCME, and think about a man who lost his life standing with AFSCME, Dr. Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
I mean, Dr. Martin Luther King died April 4th, 1968 in Memphis. He was gunned down marching with the sanitation workers of Memphis, who were simply trying to form a local of AFSCME.
That's right.
Now, this is also a critical period, April, because 50 years ago, on that same day, April 4th, a year to the day before he was killed, Dr. Martin Luther King, on April 4th, 1967, gave that speech at Riverside Church in New York, why he opposed the war in Vietnam. It was epic. It was historic. Even his closest friends said, don't do it. He had the most powerful person on earth, the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, wrapped around his finger. He got him to sign the Voting Rights Act. He got him to sign the Civil Rights Act. They said, do not mess that up. This is not your war, Vietnam. He did not agree. He saw it as a seamless way. And he got up on that podium, 3,000 people that Sunday anticipating what he had to say. In fact, Reverend Barber gave the sermon just last week in the lead up to the 50th anniversary back at Riverside Church. And Dr. King got up and he talked about the triplets, the threats: militarism, materialism, and racism. The triple threats to our society. And he said the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He was excoriated by the mainstream press afterwards. I mean, especially for young people here. If you think, well, it's easy for that guy to speak, because of course he was an icon. He could have said anything and people would accept it. But for us, young people, it's harder to make your way and speak your mind because people might be critical. Oh no. Dr. King and the corporate press, from Life magazine to the Washington Post to the New York Times, they went after him. They said his speech sounded like a script from Radio Hanoi. They said, I have the Life magazine of that week. They said he had done a disservice to his cause, his country, his people. But it didn't stop. He just doubled down and for the next year continued to make the connections between the war at home and the war abroad. Yes. And he would die April 4th, 1968. This is a history we must remember, and remember his prophetic words and how brave he was. I'm going to go from Wisconsin to the summer of 2011 when 1,200 people got arrested outside the White House, forming a circle around the Rose Garden, protesting the Keystone XL, you may remember. Oh, people like Bill McKibben, founder of 350.org, who we just interviewed this morning. Naomi Klein, who is here, she just gave a big address last night at Howard University, talking about environmental justice, talking about how important it is to understand which communities are targeted, which communities are most hurt by climate change around the world. They got arrested along with many others, and they ultimately, it wasn't President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton who just willingly decided to kill the Keystone XL. It's the movements that put enormous pressure.
Yay! Yes. Yes.
Yes. Pipeline being shut down until the new president took office. And one of his first acts, President Trump reauthorized the Keystone XL and granted the permit for the final building of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And we'll get to that in a minute. So that was the summer of 2011. Then go to September 17, 2011, just a few weeks later, Occupy Wall Street. Thousands of people stream into Zuccotti Park. They're carrying every kind of sign. Now, the corporate media went after them for this. They said, these people can't even make up their mind. They're against the death penalty, they're against war, they're against climate change, and they're concerned about inequality. And I thought, oh my God, the media's listening. Yes. Exactly how they feel about all of these issues. But they saw it as their weakness, that they couldn't settle on one issue. I saw it as their strength. And then they would say they can't even decide on their spokespeople. I mean, it isn't a leaderless movement, it's a leaderful movement, and I think we're seeing that. And among the signs that they carried into Zuccotti was, I am Troy Davis, and too much doubt. So we flew from New York on September 17th to Atlanta, Georgia, to cover the case of Troy Anthony Davis. On September 21st, 2011, Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die. We were reporting live from the grounds outside Georgia's death row in the town of Jackson, awaiting news about whether the U.S. Supreme Court would spare his life. I Am Troy Davis became a rallying cry of a growing international movement to stop his execution. The effort had grown and now included prosecutors, prison wardens, exonerated death row prisoners, a former U.S. president, and the Pope. This is the story of a struggle against death that refuses to die. Troy Anthony Davis grew up in Savannah, Georgia. He lived with his sisters, and his mother worked in the local hospital. His dad, a carpenter, was a veteran of the Korean War. On the night of August 18, 1989, Troy, who was 18 at the time, an African-American, went to Charlie Brown's pool hall with a friend. In the parking lot outside, Sylvester Red Coles, a neighborhood tough, was arguing loudly with a homeless man named Larry Young. Several witnesses testified Coles pistol whipped Young. Pool hall patrons came outside to see what was going on. Troy tried to intervene in the fight but fled when Coles threatened him with a gun. At a quarter after 1 in the morning, Mark McPhail, a white off-duty Savannah police officer who was working as a security guard at a Greyhound bus station next door, came outside to break up the fight. Gunshots pierced the summer night. Moments later, McPhail lay dying with a bullet wound to the head and another to the heart. He never drew his gun. Mark McPhail was a hero cop. He tried to help a homeless man who was being pistol whipped. The question was who killed him. Red Coles went to the police station, accompanied by a lawyer, and he identified 18-year-old Troy as the shooter. But the day after the shooting, Davis was 4 hours away in Atlanta, job hunting with his cousin. While he was there, the police launched a high-profile manhunt, splashed his picture across the newspapers and TV. His family was extremely panicked. They alerted Troy. Authorities were looking for him. His sister Martina was a hero. I mean, she was a Persian Gulf Army nurse. She had breast cancer. She not only fought for her own life, her face adorned all the breast cancer bands of Savannah to encourage women to get mammograms. She was honored as a leading light with Nancy Pelosi in Washington. But now she was going to fight for her brother's life. She went and picked up Troy, and they both decided, we'll go right to the police station. This is a case of mistaken identity. They'll understand. He was immediately arrested and charged with murder. He was held for 2 years. He was tried in 1991. On August 30th, Troy Anthony Davis, age 20, was sentenced to die. He was convicted after 2 hours of jury deliberation. 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses would later recant or change their testimony, many of them saying they had been intimidated by police. The one who would not recant was Red Coles, the man who so many of the others said was the man who killed the police officer. So, there were 3 death warrants for Troy Davis on death row. All of them were stayed. We went for the 4th. We did not know what would happen. Yes, on September 21st, 2011, the day Troy was scheduled to die, Davis's lawyers filed a request with the U.S. Supreme Court for a stay of execution. The world watched to see whether Davis's final appeal would be granted. Democracy Now! Is the only news outlet to broadcast live continuously from the prison grounds in Jackson. For 6 hours that day, we spoke with Davis's supporters, family members who held an all-day vigil. With 4 of Davis's 4 execution dates, with each of the 4, a global awareness group. Calls for clemency poured in from Nobel Peace Laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu to a former U.S. President and Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter. It was the doubt that galvanized so many around the world. The signs from Zuccotti, too much doubt, I am Troy Davis. There were vigils across the world, from Iceland to England to France to Germany. The chorus for clemency grew louder. Dr. Alan Alt, a former warden of Georgia's death row prison, who oversaw 5 executions there, sent a letter to the Georgia Governor Nathan Deal that was co-signed by 5 other retired wardens or directors of state prisons. They wrote, while most of the prisoners whose executions we participated in accepted responsibility for the crimes for which they were punished, some of us have also executed prisoners who maintained their innocence until the end. It is those cases that are most haunting to an executioner, they wrote. They pleaded with Governor Deal to halt this execution. Earlier in the day, prison authorities handed us a thin press packet. Now, I'll describe another scene of what it means to get a satellite truck on the grounds. We knew that this was too important to cover, that we would not we did not want to be prevented from covering it by the prison guards. So when we deal with the big boys, we've got to, we have to operate in their court. We got a satellite truck that was bigger than anyone else's. You know, CNN would use this van later, Fox used it, we rented it from Atlanta. The satellite trucks were lined up on the far end of the prison grounds. But the protest tent that the guards had erected to allow 150 people, you know, these would be the human rights leaders, the head of Amnesty, the head of the NAACP, Martina and the family of Troy Anthony Davis. Martina was now in a wheelchair. She would die weeks later. And then there was 1,000 people outside, you know, students from Spelman and Morehouse in Atlanta, the historically black colleges had come. They were holding candles, people from all over the world. But they were isolated in the satellite trucks. And I was wondering why none of them were protesting. I wasn't going to be there for hours just speaking myself. I had to speak to people. I was very annoyed that this satellite truck was like ours. Everyone else's were lined up. And the prison guards said we would have to join them. So when the satellite truck finally came up on the premises, they rolled down their window and they said, Miss Goodman, where do you want the truck? I said, well, the guards say you have to put it over there. They said, where do you want it? So I said, oh, that's how my irritation starts to dissolve. I said, oh, right over there by the protest pen. I'd like to talk to the people who are there. And they barreled this truck over.
Wow.
And the prison guards come running over, but then these guys got out, and they were bigger than the Oshkosh. They were definitely bigger than George's. And they brought out these huge cameras, and the guards just backed off.
Really?
And so then they formed a kind of semicircle around me with their cameras, and they said, where do you want to stand? And I said, well, not much bad. We were right in front of the rope, so I can interview people that are there. And they handed me the mic, and they said, start the broadcast. And so we did.
Yay!
That the Department of Corrections had given to the press. And they said what his schedule would be that day, Troy Davis. He could see his family till 3 o'clock, then they would have to clear out for a physical. A routine physical. Routine physical. So nearby in the local church, all these human rights leaders gathered, and the head of the local Georgia NAACP named Ed DuBose was just in shock. And he said, routine physical? So that they can make sure he's physically fit, so they can strap him down, so they can put the murder juice in his arm. Make no mistake, they call it an execution, we call it murder, he said. Well, you see, not long before that, a Texas man on death row had attempted suicide. They raced him to the hospital, they got him better, and then they executed him. Davis had turned down the Last Supper. You know, a condemned prisoner gets to decide what he eats for his last meal. And so the press kit described the standard fare that Davis would be offered. This is a quote from the press packet. Grilled cheeseburgers, oven-browned potatoes, baked beans, coleslaw, cookies, and a great beverage. Another page listed the lethal cocktail that would follow. And it was a white page, and it just had 4 lines on it with big letters for the words. My dad was an eye doctor, and this is what it reminded me of, those eye charts when you're testing your vision. Big words, 4 lines. Pentobarbital, pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride, and Ativan, a sedative. The pentobarbital anesthetizes, the pancuronium bromide paralyzes, and the potassium chloride stops the heart. Davis refused the Last Supper and the sedative. By 7 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court was reportedly reviewing Davis's plea for a stay. The case was referred to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who hails from Pinpoint, Georgia, a community founded by freed slaves that's near Savannah, where Davis has lived. The Supreme Court, needless to say, denied the plea. Davis's execution began at 10:53 p.m. The prison spokesperson delivered the news to the reporters outside, the time of death, 11:08 p.m. Then the eyewitnesses to the execution stepped out. According to an Associated Press reporter, and this is what I would have wanted to video, in the death chamber, the prisoner is strapped on the gurney is like a cross. Their arms are strapped down, their legs, and then they put the injection in the arm. Just about when the chemicals are going to flow, they open the curtains on the windows, and the audience is there. The audience is made up with the murder victim's family, who the prisoner wants to be there if they allow that, and the reporters. So Troy Davis was strapped down, and the AP reporter came outside and described his last words. He said, "I'd like to address the McPhail family. Let you know I'm not the one who killed your son, your father, your brother. I am innocent. I do not have a gun. All I can ask is that you look deeper into this case so that you really can finally see the truth. I ask my family and friends to continue to fight this fight." And then he looked at his executioners and said, "For those about to take my life, God have mercy on your souls, and may God bless your souls." The state of Georgia took Troy's body to Atlanta for an autopsy, charging his family for the transportation. On Troy Davis's death certificate, the cause of death is listed simply as homicide. As we stood on the grounds of the prison, it was about 1:45 now. Just after Troy Davis was executed, the Georgia Department of Corrections threatened to pull the plug on our broadcast. The show was over. I was reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi reportedly answered when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He said, "I think it would be a good idea." That is what happened in September of 2011. Then, the end of that year, we went to South Africa for the UN Climate Summit, as we go every year from Copenhagen to Cancun, from Durban to Doha, from Poland to Peru, and this past year to Paris. All of these issues connected. And you might say, why do we bother to go cover the only national broadcast in the United States? This is the country that is historically the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. Why do we bother to go? What happens inside these summits? It's not what happens inside. That's true. It's what happens outside. Thousands of people from the most hard-hit areas of the world by climate change through no fault of their own. I mean, you had the 15-year-old boy from the Maldives in Copenhagen who looked directly into our camera and said, "You are drowning my country." You look, we broadcast the voices of the people of sub-Saharan Africa who say, "You are cooking our continent." This is why we go to these summits. And on that year, there was a breach. Some of the people outside, instead of being arrested, as usual, were allowed in. And it was the youth, the last days of the summit. And they chose as their spokesperson a young woman named Anjali Patara, who went to a school in Bar Harbor, Maine called College of the Atlantic. And she was chosen to address this world body of scientists, world leaders, bureaucrats, government officials. And this is a part of what she said. "I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all of my life. You've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, you've broken promises, but you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. The International Energy Agency tells us we have 5 years until the window to avoid irreversible climate change closes. The science tells us we have 5 years maximum. You're saying, give us 10. The starkest betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition. Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. She said there is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, and to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality, she said. And then she ended with a quote of Nelson Mandela. She said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And then she looked out on the vast audience and said, "So, distinguished delegates and governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now, get it done." And there was actually applause across the room. And the president of the COP, that's the Conference of Parties, the UN Summit, actually said into the microphone, on a purely personal note, "I wonder why he said, on a purely personal note, I wonder why we let not speak half the world's population first in this conference, but only last." So the following year in Doha, I bumped into Anjali outside the summit and I said, "Are you coming in?" And she said, "No, I've been banned." But her work and the work of so many young people around the world really culminates today. In this first 100 days, as the media, and you'll see it if you turn on any of the networks, evaluates the first 100 days of Donald Trump, they must also spend time talking about the growing resistance that we have seen in this 100 days. There is a force more powerful than one person, even if he occupies the most powerful office on earth, and that is the people. People like you all over this country join together with people around the world, whether we're talking about the protests the day after Donald Trump was inaugurated. I mean, this was astounding, led by women. Or the protests spontaneous around the country that represented the best of America when Muslim ban 1 came down. Now, let's be clear. What President Trump is saying today, you may have heard in these last few days, he says this first 100 days is historic. It's the best 100 days of any president in the history of the United States.
Wow.
The best and most successful 100 days.
In a church in Washington, D.C.
Now, on the issue of fake news, it takes one to know. And when you think of what Donald Trump did long before he ran for president, leader of the birther movement, the deep racism implicit in this, whatever you think of President Obama over the 8 years, yes, he didn't close Guantanamo, expanded the drone wars around the world, and also did not stop the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that Donald Trump is expanding today.
Sorry, guys.
Whether he was born in the United States is not a question. The fact that he was the first African-American president was extremely important and clearly important to Donald Trump, which is why he wanted to delegitimize him and spent years.
They all did. The whole freaking party.
Movement saying he had the smoking gun, that he had sent investigators to Hawaii. Where is any of this information? And then accusing President Obama of being Muslim. Now, this is a very difficult issue to address, because when you say no, he's not Muslim, it sounds like there's something wrong with being Muslim. And it's just put any religion. No, of course he's not Jewish. No, he is not Christian. No, of course he's not Hindu. You understand you are in a catch-22. There's nothing you can say that expresses how important it is that we simply be accurate. Donald Trump led that movement. It is the reason why I believe he was endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan. He was supported by David Duke. And, that goes to Pacificus history. which is such an important one, which is why it's so important to support WPFW. We're five states in New York, in Berkeley, California, Los Angeles, here in Washington, celebrating 40 years this year, WPFW. KPFT in the Metro of Houston went on the air in 1970, 7 years older than WPFW, and it was blown off the air within weeks by the Ku Klux Klan. They strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. A few weeks later, KPFT got back on their feet, they rebuilt their transmitter, and they strapped 15 times the dynamite to the transmitter and blew it up again. It was right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant. Wow. And I thought that was a good song. But they would get back on their feet after months. It was January 1971. Arlo Guthrie came back to sing Alice's Restaurant on the air, and they went back on the air. I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops, because I often confuse them. But he said it was his proudest act. I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, dangerous independent media is, dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves.
Like us.
And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child that Reverend Hagler may have visited in Palestine, or an Israeli grandmother, whether it is an elder at the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation, or an uncle in Iran. When you hear someone speaking from their own experience, it makes it much less likely that you'll want to destroy them. I mean, I'm not saying you'll agree with them. How often do we even agree with our family members? But you don't want to wipe them out. That understanding is the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it is wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back.
That's right. And citizens journalism like us.
I want to talk about two more issues very quickly. And then I think Reverend Hagler is going to get up, and we're going to be signing books. And you don't have to get books to come up and say hi, but a couple things. I don't know if we're giving out the daily digests, but there are ways, Dennis, have they been circulated? Well, we will pass them around. You can sign up, and you can get our news headlines every day. But you can also do it right from your phone. Especially young folks might know how to do this. You send the word Democracy Now, no space, to the number 66866, and that signs you up. That's Democracy Now, one word, to 66866. But anyway, if you have story ideas, send them to stories@democracynow.org. And if you get 2 copies of the book, you can get one of 2 DVDs for free. One of them is our last interview with Noam Chomsky. It's wonderful. And the other is the Oscar-nominated film by my colleague, who started with Democracy Now! As a journalist, Jeremy Scahill. And it's a wonderful film about drone strikes and dirty wars around the world. Why would you get 2 books? You can give one to a library. You can save one for a birthday gift. We are trying to drive this book up the New York Times bestseller list. They may not mention us very much, but when we have a bestseller, it's just a mathematical equation, and they're forced to. And what it means to get on a bestseller list, it means libraries take your book, universities take your book, and it means, a lot of bookstores are not like Politics and Prose, which is unique, another sanctuary of dissent. But in a lot of bookstores, all they stock is the bestsellers. It's all based on the bestseller list. It's not hand-selling by people in the bookstore who know these books and can talk to you about them. It's a whole different scene. But good people go into those Walmarts of bookstores. And we want to send them as kind of roadmap to a whole different universe of thinking. So next time, they'll look for a bookstore like Politics and Prose. So that's all the reasons too. And even if you don't get one book, you can come up and say hi. I love that.
Oh boy.
But these last 2 stories, It is wonderful to be here at the church. I was just in a church in Denver 2 weeks ago when we were doing a fundraiser for community media there. And the next morning we raced off to the Unitarian church because Jeanette Vizgara was inside. She's a Mexican immigrant who's been in this country 20 years, paid taxes every year, has 4 kids. Her oldest daughter is Daca, and her littlest girl is named Zuri, and she's 6, and Roberto, he's 10, and I got to meet the youngest too. And she took refuge in the church after Donald Trump was inaugurated. Well, she was really scared because Daniel Ramirez in Washington State was picked up, and he was DACA, he was a dreamer. He was legally allowed to be here, and he was arrested. And she got really scared.
Oh, boy.
And she went into the church. It's a sanctuary church. And that's where she is now. She organizes from morning until night. And her little boy, Roberto, who is a little feather of a boy, speaks perfect English, goes to the local public schools. His teacher made a gorgeous lithograph of Jeanette with her Mayan features. And it says, "Keep families united." And he had his arm around her and was holding the poster. And he was going out to a Cesar Chavez march with Zuri, his 6-year-old sister, that day, to sell the lithographs that supports them and supports the immigrants' rights movement. And he said, "My mother can't come with us. I am my mother's voice," as she seeks protection. She's gotten death threats. And I said, "So what gives you hope?" She said, "Oh, because many more people have sent me emails and have expressed their support. Even the Denver police chief came over to say, 'I will protect you. You tell me if you have any death threats.'" The Denver mayor has said he will protect her. And the local congressman, Jared Polis, has also voiced his support for her. It is amazing when you have a sanctuary community. I mean, Juan Gonzalez and I went to a meeting a couple weeks ago in New York. It was much smaller than this room, and it was packed with hundreds of people. Not your conventional noble activists who are often in the street. It was city council members, it was state legislators, it was mayors. They all gathered in New York to talk about how do we provide sanctuary to people in our community. This is the new resistance. It's across the political spectrum. We played that on Democracy Now! And the next day, Time magazine announced its 100 most important people in the world. Jeanette Vizgara is one of them.
Oh my God, that's wonderful.
I had a gala in New York, right? Everyone was there, like John Lennon, legend, who had very interesting things to say about President Trump when he was asked. Big gala, but Jeanette couldn't go, even though she's one of the 100 most important people, because she can't step foot outside or she'll be arrested by ICE. So they held this past Tuesday in the church their own gala for this very important woman. And the next morning, Arturo Hernandez, a man I visited 2 years ago in the church, who'd taken refuge, who was about to be deported under Obama, but ultimately got a letter that said, you are a low priority. You are not a priority for us to deport you. And he took that letter and he said, I wanted to show good faith and let other people know who are undocumented that you don't have to be afraid. And he stepped out of the church and he's been working for the last 2 years with, and continued to work with his brother-in-law. They have a tile business. And on Wednesday morning, this past Wednesday, as he was going to his tile business with his brother-in-law, ICE picked him up. They couldn't get Jeanette. She's inside the church, so they got the man who was outside. And he's now been taken. And oddly, I talked to American Friends Service Committee, who was talking to ICE, who's very involved with Arturo's case. And she said to him, her name is Jennifer Piper, she said to ICE, what are you doing? He has this letter that says he is not a priority. This is an upstanding member of our society who is revered. They're all immigrants' rights activists. And she said, he's got the letter that says he's not a priority. And ICE's response is, we don't have priorities anymore. I thought that was an interesting way to put it.
Wow.
And so he has been taken. And we were just in Vermont, and 2 of the leading migrant justice activists, Zuli Palacios and Kike Balcazar, We also spoke in a Unitarian church there in Burlington, and they came out for this. They also just happened to have come out of jail. They were picked up on the side of the road by ICE, even though Burlington is becoming a sanctuary city. While the police aren't cooperating, the ICE agents are moving in. And this is sending a terrifying message to the millions of people who feel insecure here. I was talking to a Baltimore City councilman at that meeting in New York. He said in some schools, 20 to 30% of the kids are not coming to school because their parents are too afraid. This is something that everyone has to unite around. We all know what this is all about. And as a Jewish American and a granddaughter of an Orthodox rabbi whose family was deeply affected by the Holocaust, I well know the stories of the voyage of the damned, the Jews who were in a ship who came to the United States and sadly were rejected by the United States and went home to their death. Refuge is an idea, and refugees that this country was founded on. Yeah. Now, I want to end with the story of Standing Rock. How important it is, the original people of this continent, and what is happening today. You know, Standing Rock began on April 1st when one woman, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux, opened her property to anyone who would come to resist the Dakota Access Pipeline. It's beautiful property on the banks of the Cannonball River in North Dakota. See, the Standing Rock Sioux have been fighting the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline that would snake its way, they call it the Black Snake, snake its way, taking fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota to South Dakota to Iowa to Illinois, and then link up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. And they said no, because the pipeline would go under the Missouri River, and that could pollute the water of the longest river in North America, and could endanger 17 million people, not just Native American. They say we're doing this for everyone. And also it would snake its way through their tribal burial grounds. And they said no. I mean, the fact is, the people of Bismarck, North Dakota, and Mandan, North Dakota, they also said no. And so the pipeline was not put in their area. The Native Americans just want to be treated like any North Dakotans. They haven't been so lucky. And so LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, who was out there in the rage and heat today here in Washington, and so many other people started to resist. That camp became so big that another and another and another resistance camp was built, like the Red Warrior Camp, and all in this area. This is all through the election of 2016, right? All through this election season. So we go in a Labor Day weekend. That's even too late. We were reporting on it before, but actually on the ground then. And we go to cover what's happening. And people are having ceremonies, and we follow them to an area that they're going to plant their native flags. They didn't think that the pipeline company was going to be working. It was Labor Day weekend. They just went to perform a ceremony. And that's when they saw the bulldozers operating at full tilt. Now, a few days before, the judge had asked, there was a judge that was ruling on the case, if you say this is your sacred burial ground, prove it. Give me a map of where you say those burial mounds are. So the historians of the reservation made that map for the judge. They handed it over, and he gave it to Energy Transfer Partners that owns Dakota Access Pipeline. Boo. And the Native Americans believed those bulldozers that were way down the road before that weekend leapfrogged over all of this area to go right to the area they had designated on the map. Nice. Because the judge was going to rule the next week. And if they changed the facts on the ground, if all of this area was dug up, it would be a moot point. So the people were astounded when they saw these bulldozers. And they came up on the property. First, it was women and their children. And they started to demand that the bulldozers pull back. I was very scared at this point. We were just filming. The bravery of these small acts I mean, when you stand in front of an operating bulldozer, it made me think of March 16, 2003. In another area of the world. It was 3 days before the Iraq invasion. It was in Raqqa, in Gaza. A young woman from Evergreen College in Washington named Rachel Corey, who, together with other members of the International Solidarity Movement, donned these bright orange, like construction workers wear vests. And she befriended a Palestinian family, a pharmacist family, and the Israeli military was going to bulldoze their house. The bulldozers in Israel there, made by Caterpillar here, and run by the Israeli military. And she stood in front of his house, and in front of the bulldozer, and it just carved her up. It just crushed her from moving earth. You don't realize when you're standing there how dangerous this is, but I can only remember that and see women and children standing in front of the bulldozers, how incredibly brave. And they actually, though, succeeded in pushing the bulldozers back. And they kept marching forward as the bulldozers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pulled back. It was amazing. Wow. They had prevailed until the Dakota Access Pipeline guards unleashed dogs on the, not protesters, they call themselves water protectors.
Yeah.
Dogs. And the dogs would bite the Native Americans and their horses. Even the dogs would pull back, and the guards would push them into the crowd. And we filmed a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with blood. Wow. Ultimately, though, the bulldozers and all of the guards left. And we uploaded this video. And that next day or two, there were 14 million views on Facebook. Now, why is this important? It's through the election season. This was the largest unification of Native American tribes we've seen in decades, from Latin America, from the United States, from Canada, First Nations. This is historic. And the media hardly covered climate change during the election. In the major election debates, I don't really call them journalists, I call them news personalities. They did not ask one question about climate change. Not one. And, you know, the media will say, because people aren't interested in this, you know, they're selling product. Now, what is that product? Every 5 or 6 minutes there's a commercial, and it's either a weapons manufacturer or an oil or gas or coal company. If you're wondering why they stay away from these issues. Another reason why it's so important to support WPFW. I brought you guys
and all citizens journalists as well.
About healthcare, but brought to you by listeners like you. So they didn't cover this. And this, you know, gives the lie to them saying no one's interested. 14 million views in 24 hours. It was unbelievable how interested people were across the country. So we went back to New York to continue broadcasting the March Now, and that was the Labor Day weekend. On Thursday, the governor at the time, Governor Jack Dalrymple, called out the National Guard because Friday the decision was going to come down, and it didn't look good for the tribe. And they did something quietly. Which was they issued an arrest warrant for me. I didn't know about it at the time. And on Friday, by the way, the judge ruled against the tribe. Yes, the U.S. Justice Department prevailed over the tribe. And, you know, they were about to pop their champagne corks. And 15 minutes later, an unprecedented 3-agency letter from the Army Corps of Engineers, Interior, and Justice, the very same Justice Department that beat the tribe, issued a letter that said they weren't going to move forward. That they were going to reevaluate, see if there was Native input, see if there was environmental impact statement, everything the Native Americans had been saying. President Obama had been in Asia that week, and he made his first trip to Laos. And there he held a democracy forum for young Asians. They came in from all over. And I think the final question was from a young Malaysian woman. She raised her hand. She said, President Obama, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline? The question that no American journalist had publicly asked President Obama.
Unbelievable.
Now, he held forth, he was eloquent on the history of oppression of Native Americans. And then he actually went on to say, on the issue of DAPL, I have to discuss that with my team, and then I'll get back to you. And then word has it he came back, that was that week, right before the judge ruled. And you might have seen the video of the dogs. You know, that Saturday, we also interviewed the Day of the Dogs. We interviewed Winona LaDue, you know, great indigenous rights activist. She, you know, had erected her teepee on one of the resistance camps. And she said, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama 1965. We are through. And I clearly, the first African American president, the dogs were not lost on him. So on Friday, I had flown up to Canada for the Toronto International Film Festival because a new film was premiering called All Governments Lie. It was about the great muckraking journalist I.F. Stone. And, you know, he taught students that, yeah, I got to remember 2 words, governments lie. And if you can remember 3, all governments lie. So it was a film about his life and it talked about independent news organizations today, like Matt Taibbi with Rolling Stone, and Nermeen Sheikh and I went up from Democracy Now! And we went up to speak after the film. And I thought it was worth going because people in Canada care about First Nations. We just come from North Dakota. We're going to talk about it. And the next day we were invited to the University of Toronto, and we also spoke. And in the middle of my speech, I got a text. And it said, you're under arrest. And it was in the middle of my speech. And it said something like, there's an arrest warrant for you. And I didn't even recognize the number. Is this some kind of scam? But I did notice that the number was from North Dakota. And it turned out it was a North Dakota lawyer. But I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to say anything because I thought, wow, I am in Canada right now. I have to get back. You know, when there's an arrest warrant for you, you won't necessarily be picked right up. But if you have interaction with police or FBI or border guards, that's when, if you're in the system, they're going to take you. So I had to get over that border. So in the middle of talk, I just said, could someone call me a cab, please? That's the airport. I didn't even say airport. I didn't want to just raise that.
Right.
Whoever was there. So I got to the airport, wanted to get there before I got into the system, and I did manage to come back to New York. That was fine. But I also didn't take this arrest warrant personally. I felt that they were issuing a message to all journalists, do not come to North Dakota, which is exactly why we need to be in North Dakota.
Yeah.
Especially young journalists to feel they couldn't go cover this, because how do they have the resources to deal if they're going to end up in jail? This had to be challenged. And so a few weeks later, we flew back to North Dakota. And as we flew into Bismarck, as we landed, the North Dakota prosecutor announced that he was dropping the charges against me. We called this one. But that he would bring new charges against me. Right. And I faced up to a year in jail. So this was Friday. We were in North Dakota, and I would be arraigned on Monday. So that gave us the whole weekend to cover the struggle.
My phone's gonna die.
So everywhere we covered the struggle of the Standing Rock Sioux and the standoff with Standing Rock. And on Monday morning, we did this broadcast from in front of the Mandan courthouse and jail, where I would turn myself in after the broadcast. And it's the courthouse, it's the jail, and it's the 10 Commandments in between. So we began the broadcast. And we had on that day, in front of the courthouse, Dave Archibald, the chair of the Standing Rock Sioux. He had been arrested months before. Low-level civil disobedience misdemeanor charge because he was standing up for the Standing Rock Sioux. Low-level charge. He was strip searched, he was put in an orange jumpsuit, and he was jailed. We had on Dr. Sarah Jumping Mule, the pediatrician at the Standing Rock Reservation, who cared about the health of her children. She was arrested, low-level misdemeanor. She was strip searched, she was orange jumpsuited, and she was jailed. I mean, the humiliation on top of the desecration of their lands. I met actually one of the Dakota Access guards at the airport in one of these trips. And he came over to me, recognized me from the video. He said, I was reading some magazines, and he said, don't think I don't know who you are. I said, oh, well, who are you? And he said, I was one of the guards, I was there. I didn't unleash the dogs. He said, that was another security firm. They hired a group of firms, and he said, don't think I don't understand that we sick dogs on them. We commit massacres for hundreds of years. You don't think I understand why they're mad? You know, never underestimate who might be your ally. So we broadcast from in front of the jail. After the show, hundreds of Native Americans came to show solidarity. And there was so much pressure on the judge who had to sign off on the charges before the arraignment. Well, we had issued a press release naming him and saying he had to make it. And all of the international press was now involved. All the papers, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Vogue magazine. They were BBC, Al Jazeera, that he decided not to sign off on the charges. And many of the Native Americans who were going to court that day had their felonies and misdemeanors dropped. This shows why it matters when the spotlight is shining.
That's right. That's right. That's right. We got to keep doing it. Citizen journalism.
I'm just going to end by saying, in December 5th, that another three-agency letter came out from, clearly coordinated by the White House that said they were not going to push through this pipeline. They wouldn't grab that last permit under the Missouri River. This was under President Obama. That they would look to resolve this in another way, maybe reroute or maybe not allow it to go forward at all. Incredible victory for Standing Rock.
For 5 months.
Until President Trump came into office. And this goes to what he has said about the most successful 100 days in the history of any presidency in this country. What he is basing that on the number of executive orders that he issued, of which there have been numerous ones. Among the first was moving forward with the Keystone XL as well as the Dakota Access Pipeline. But many of them are, we'll do a study on this and a study on that. It's just to issue the executive orders. And he said that they would move forward, and they have built the pipeline now under the Missouri River. I mean, what we see in Washington is an oligarchy. I mean, you've got Rex Tillerson, former CEO of the largest private oil corporation in the world, ExxonMobil, who's now Secretary of State.
Yep.
You've got Scott Pruitt, who is now the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, as Oklahoma Attorney General. Oklahoma, which hardly ever knew an earthquake, now is the land of quakes.
Yep, because of fracking.
Who sued the EPA 14 times, is now head of that agency. And then you've got Governor Perry, the former governor of Texas, who is the Secretary of Energy. When he ran for President Price, he was bankrolled to the tune of $6 million by Kelsey Warren, who is the CEO of Energy Transfer Partners, which owns the Dakota Access Pipeline. When he stepped down as governor, he immediately went onto the board of the Dakota Access Pipeline of Energy Transfer Partners, stepped down only to become Secretary of Energy. This is all extremely serious. And yes, they are moving forward, but so is the resistance all over. And that's why one of the things that people pointed out today, there were many people from Standing Rock and Native Americans who've been involved in that struggle were on the march today. And by the way, the organizers say there were between 150 and 200,000 protesters today. Oil has passed through that pipeline, and there is this now global divestment movement. Just last few weeks, we covered the march in front of Wells Fargo in New York. The banks, an understanding of the financial institutions that are supporting not just the Dakota Access Pipeline, but what the Standing Rock Sioux have brought us is this deep understanding of the financial institutions that are invested in the fossil fuel economy. And also that the Native Americans are not just talking about one pipeline. What they're talking about is ultimately the fate of the planet. And that is what is actually most hopeful. I really do believe that those who are concerned about war and peace, those who are concerned about the growing inequality in this country, who are concerned about climate change, the fate of the planet, who are concerned about racial, economic, and social justice, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we must support the independent media. Going back to World War II, to the time when Pacifica was founded, but in Germany, to a brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl. They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians, but they thought and said, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocities? And so together with their professor and other students and workers, they decided to release a series of pamphlets so that the Germans would never be able to say we didn't know. And on one of those pamphlets were written the words, "We will not be silent." You know, at the March for Science, so many people
We
wore
will
this
not be
button that
silent.
said, "Science, not silence." But across the pamphlet, "We will not
Be silent.
Hans and Sophie and their professor were captured by the Nazis. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy now.
I'm sorry, I have to go, and we're going to try to meet Amy. Love you. Have a great night.